The largest empire in history was the British Empire. At its peak, it controlled 35.5 million square kilometers, or nearly 24% of the world. The country of Britannia is located on a small island in Western Europe. So you might be asking, if the empire was so big and strong, how did it fall? Well, in this video, we'll try to answer this question. To begin to answer this question, we need to go back on what made the empire strong in the first place. Its rise wasn't an accident. Britain had a unique combination of geography, economy, military power, and political structures that allowed it to dominate the world for centuries. Britain is an island nation, which meant neutral protection from invasions, unlike continental powers, which had trouble defending their borders. This meant Britannia had a strong incentive to build a powerful navy. By the 18th to 19th century, the Royal Navy was the most powerful in the world, protecting trade routes and colonies. Sea power allowed Britain to project force globally, in America, India, Africa, and Asia. But before all this, the island was not home to a country, but inhabited by Celtic tribes. In the year 43 or 410 CE, the Roman Empire conquered most of England and Wales. While the Romans were there, they built towns, roads, and the Hadrian Wall. This wall was the border of the Roman Empire, and how it advanced on the island. Beyond this wall was unconquered territory. After the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, each province of the empire became independent. But it didn't stay that way for long, because there was another invasion. This was from the north, which in modern day we would call the Vikings. From this invasion, several kingdoms would emerge, which were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. These kingdoms would later come together to form the Kingdom of England. During these times, there were still wars among each kingdom. It would take a lot more time for these people to come together to form a nation. In the year 1215, the Magna Carta was signed. This was very important. For reason number one, it limited the power that kings had at the time. King John had been ruling arbitrarily. He was raising taxes without consent, seizing land, and punishing nobles unfairly. The Magna Carta forced him to accept that even the king had to follow the law. It also gave some rights to free men, such as protection from unlawful imprisonment, fair trials, and limits on taxation without consent. It introduced the principle that no one is above the law, not even the king. This idea became the foundation of English common law and later democratic systems. Clause 12 required that taxes could only be raised with the Common Council of the realm. Over time, this developed into English Parliament, where representatives had a say in taxation and governance. In short, the Magna Carta turned absolute monarchy into a constitutional monarchy. Another reason why this was so important was because it made the kingdom more stable, and the Magna Carta tried to stop corruption, which plagued so many countries, and stops them from growing. And the next big event that would occur would be between France and England, which was the 100 Years' War. Starting in 1337 and ending in 1453, the cause of the war came from the English kings who had claims on the French throne through family ties, such as Edward III in 1337. The key moments during the war were early English victories, though they didn't last. Also during the war, they saw the improvement of firearms, such as the longbow's effectiveness in battle. Later French revival under Joan of Arc. The war ended with England losing almost all of its land in France. The reason why this was important, enough to last 100 years, was because England and France became more clear defined as separate nations, each with their own identity. It also changed Parliament's roles. The kings had to ask Parliament for money, which gave Parliament more power. Also, military change occurred. It shifted from knights and castles to professional armies and new weapons, like longbows and gunpowder. The defeat in France weakened the English monarchy, helping to lead the War of the Roses at home. The next king had immense change for England and its future, which was King Henry VIII. Henry wanted an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, which the Pope refused. In response, he broke from the Catholic Church and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. The reason why this mattered was because England became a Protestant nation, separating from the papal authority. This started the English Reformation, reshaping religion, politics, and society. It gave monarchy more control over religion and weakened the Pope's influence in England. Henry closed monasteries and took their wealth and land. This gave the crown immense new resources and redistributed land to nobles loyal to him. This mattered because it prominently reduced the Catholic Church's power and strengthened the Tudor state. Henry invested heavily in ships and dockyards, creating the foundation of the Royal Navy. The creation of these shipyards was important because it secured England from invasion. It laid groundwork for a future England as a global naval power, leading to an empire. By making himself head of the both state and church, Henry concentrated power in the crown. Parliament's role also grew, since Henry used it to pass key religious laws. This set a precedent for lawmaking in England. The next event that would occur would be the line of succession in Scotland, because in 1603 Elizabeth I of England, the last Tudor monarch, died without any children. The nearest heir was James of Scotland, the great-grandson of Henry VIII of England. This allowed James to inherit the English throne, becoming James I of England, while still ruling Scotland as James IV. In 1603, the union of the crowns, James of Scotland became James I of England. England and Scotland, still separate kingdoms, were ruled under one monarch, but they now had one monarch ruling both countries. James called the, quote, King of Great Britain, unquote. His preferred title, though not legally recognized at the time. It didn't create yet a single nation, but it was the beginning of closer ties between England and Scotland. A full political union wouldn't happen until 1707, but James set the stage. With the same monarch ruling both kingdoms, conflict between England and Scotland stopped. This freed up resources for England to focus on more overseas exploration and colonization. James tried to unify symbols. He created the Union flag, early version of today's Union Jack, by combining England's St. George's Cross with Scotland's St. Andrew's Cross. England and Scotland had very different religious traditions, which caused friction. In England, many Protestants, especially Puritans, hoped James would reform the Church of England further. Instead, he authorized the King James Bible in 1611, a hugely influential text. His belief in the, quote, divine rights of king, unquote, also laid groundwork for conflicts between monarch and parliament, which would later erupt in the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. But they still were not considered a superpower at this time. Spain and France had much larger navies, and the Ottoman Empire still dominated most of the Middle East. But the unification of the two crowns, they were on their way, and it was only a matter of time. And finally the time came where the island was united under one flag, which was the year 1707, which was called the Acts of Union, passed by both English Parliament and Scottish Parliament, which meant they were basically one country. England and Scotland were no longer just under the same king. They were one kingdom, united politically. Scots now had access to English overseas trade and colonies. Scottish merchants and soldiers and thinkers became central to the empire. Centuries of wars between England and Scotland effectively ended. Britain could now focus outward, not inward. By pooling in resources such as manpower and trade networks, Great Britain began its rise as one of the world's dominant powers in the 18th century. Now that the nation was under one flag, they could start to expand outward, and their first target was on the Western Hemisphere. Great Britain had already established some colonies in the Americas, but they were not the only ones there. There were also other European powers, such as France and Spain, who had stakes in this part of the world. And with the tensions rising, there would be another global war, which started in 1756 and ended in 1763, which was the 7 Years' War. The fuse that lit the fire that would become the 7 Years' War was when Prussia invaded Saxony in 1756, fearing a coordinated attack by Austria, France, and Russia. This invasion escalated into a full-scale European war. France allied with Austria against Prussia, Britain allied with Prussia to counter France and Austria. This was one of the first wars with multiple different fronts. In North America, the French and Indian War, part of the 7 Years' War, began over the Ohio River Valley, where both British and French settlers wanted control. In India, British and French East India companies were fighting for trade dominance, leading to military engagements. The underlying causes of this war was long-term imperial rivalry, territorial disputes, and balance of power in Europe. Economic interest in colonies drove global conflicts far beyond Europe. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The outcome of this war was Great Britain gained Canada and all of French territory east of the Mississippi River in North America, took control of Florida from Spain, and gained dominance in India at the expense of France. While France lost almost all of its Northern American colonies, keeping only a few Caribbean islands, ones with sugar. They lost influence in India, but maintained a few trading posts. Spain also lost Florida, but gained Louisiana from the France. Prussia retained Silesia, cementing its rise as a major European power. The war was a major victory for the British. They had become the world's dominant colonial power. With France weakened, both in Europe and overseas, the stage was set for internal unrest. That eventually led to the French Revolution. Native peoples in North America lost French support and faced increased British expansion. This war also told other powers that Britain was not someone to mess with, and they were not afraid of fighting. It showed their superior navy and vast amounts of resources. But for Britain, it was not all perfect. This war had come at a huge cost, especially in money. Huge war debts led to higher taxes in the colonies, fueling resentment and contributed to the American Revolution. The war also marked the beginning of the British Empire's global dominance and the decline of the French imperial influence. To sum up what happened during this time, the 7 Years' War redrew the world map. Britain became the dominant global power, Prussia rose as a European power, and France's colonial losses set the stage for future upheaval. Economical and political tensions created that they would lead an American and French Revolution. But there was also unrest, especially in North America, which would lead to the War of Independence from the British. The reason for this was the debt that Great Britain had found herself in after the 7 Years' War. This meant they needed money and took it from their colonies, which the colonists did not like. And in 1775, the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The news of the bloodshed rocketed among the eastern seaboard, and thousands of volunteers converged. It would later be called the Minutemen. These were the beginning of the Continental Army. With their eventual defeat in 1783, the Treaty of Paris, they had lost a connection and a way to make money from the Western Hemisphere. The defeat exposed weaknesses in the British Army and Navy, poor coordination across such a large territory, challenges of fighting far from home, lessons learned helped Britain later succeed in India and the Napoleonic Wars. But in a way, it was a victory for them. This was because of the Proclamation of 1763. To avoid costly conflicts with the Native Americans after the war, Britain issued a law prohibiting colonial settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. The goal of this was to protect native lands, reduce frontier conflicts, and expensive military campaigns, which colonialists were angry because they had fought for their right to expand out west. Strategically, Britain had more territory and control than ever before. They managed the frontier indirectly using treaties with Native American tribes to keep peace. The limitation on westward expansion allowed Britain to consolidate its gains instead of overextending its military. It also allowed trade routes and fur trading networks in the west. The restrictions angered colonists and fueled revolutionary resentment because they felt denied land and opportunities despite Britain's victory. So in the bigger picture, militarily and diplomatically, Britain won the war. Politically, the victory created tensions that eventually led to the American Revolution. And since the new country of the United States was now founded, they could expand westward because they didn't sign the Treaty of 1763. And now Great Britain can trade with America, and they could focus on other continents, which they had more control over. At this time, Great Britain still had the world's greatest navy, which was important because of their next adventure. That would lead them to the Indian subcontinent. To give some context, before the English had come to India, the subcontinent was ruled by the Mughal Empire, which had dominated India for centuries, but began to weaken after the death of their emperor in 1707. This instability caused certain regional powers to rise. For example, the Marathas in western India, the Sikhs in Punjab, and the Nais in Hyderabad. This political fragmentation created opportunities for the East India Company to play local rulers against one another. The turning point in Bengal, the richest province of India, the East India Company clashed with local ruler Nawab. The company, led by Robert Clive, bribed and persuaded several of Nawab's key generals to betray him. In 1757, at the Battle of Pisai, the company defeated Siraj Dullah. This gave the East India Company control over Bengal's revenue, like tax money. This was the true beginning of British political power in India, and this was just the beginning. There would be more battles like this, like early expansions of company rule in the 1760s to 1857. The Battle of Buxar in 1764 secured company control over Bengal, Bihar, and Osir. Dewari writes, in 1765, the Mughal Empire formally gave the company the right to collect taxes in Bengal. The company used revenue from Bengal to expand its army, mostly composed of Indian soldiers, called sepoys. Through wars, treaties, and alliances, the company extended its control. In South India, the wars against the Sultan of Mysore, defeated in 1799. West and controlled India defeated the Marathas in 1817. The Punjab's conquest after wars with the Sikh Empire in 1849. So, by the mid-1800s, the East India Company controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, either directly or indirectly through princely states. India was not conquered all at once, it was absorbed piece by piece. After 1857, the British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control. India became the, quote, jewel in the crown of the British Empire, prized for its resources like cotton, tea, opium, and jute, its markets for British goods. Railways, telegraphs, and canals were built, partly for British economy interest, partly for control. A rigid racial and administration hierarchy developed. A small British elite ruled over the millions of Indians. Indian nationalism grew in response, leading to eventually the independence in the 20th century. But while the British occupied India, they had changed some things about the country. After 1858, India was governed directly by the British Crown. represented by a viceroy in India. They created the Indian Civil Service, a bureaucracy mostly run by British officials, though later some Indians joined. They allied with local princes. About 40% of India remained princely states, under indirect rule, but real power was with the British. They used a divide and rule strategy, playing Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and regional groups against one another. India essentially became a colony for raw materials like cotton and tea and opium and indigo, which were exported to Britain. Britain fled to India with cheap factory-made goods, destroying India's traditional handcrafted textile industries. Famines were frequent because cash crops were prioritized over food crops, and taxes were high. The railroads and telegraphs and ports were built originally to move troops and raw materials. They later helped connect Indians, spread ideas, and fuel nationalism. They banned practices they saw as backward, like sati, which was widow burning, and banditry. Cities like Mumbai and Madras grew as an administrative and economic center. They built one of the largest railroad networks in the world, mostly for trade and military. They also built canals, bridges, and roads, but often for resource extraction. They established universities, like the ones in Mumbai, and English-language schools. India would later be called the crown jewel of the empire because much of its resources and money it was making them. They took this money and put it into their navy, which without they would not be able to hold so many dominions. Conquering India wasn't just about fighting battles there. It was about shipping soldiers, weapons, and money across 8,000 plus miles of ocean. The British Navy transported company troops, then later crown forces, safely to India. During revolts like in 1857, the Navy ensured reinforcements could be rushed in. Britain needed to control the Indian Ocean trade routes to keep India profitable. The Royal Navy policed privacy and secured shipping. Bases like at Mumbai and Madras became not just trading posts but also naval stations. Later control of the Suez Canal after 1869 made the route to India even shorter and safer. The Navy linked India to other colonies, for example. It was a gateway to China to sell opium. Cotton went from India to the British mills. During their time there, they introduced a uniform legal code with courts, judges, and written laws. It ended many arbitrary punishments and created a framework for property rights and contracts. Early local self-government institutions, like councils and legislative councils, gave Indians political experience. Another thing they brought was introduce modern industries like tea plantations, coal mining, and mills. They brought the postal system and the telegraph and newspaper, which helped unify people. India entered the global economy, though usually on British terms. Before the British, India was divided into many kingdoms and empires. British rule, although harsh, created a single political unit with a common administration, railways, and communication system. This ironically made it easier for the Indians to unite later in demanding independence. The British had many colonies, but India is one of their best in terms of profit. The next big event for the British were the Napoleonic Wars, which deserves its own video, but in the context for this video we need to see how the war affected the British Empire. The reason why the British even joined the war on France because they saw revolutionary France and later Napoleon's empire as a direct threat to secure trade and balance of power in Europe. The French Revolution in 1789 shocked Europe. The monarchy was overthrown, the king executed, and radical republican ideas spread. Britain's ruling elite feared that the revolution might inspire uprisings at home. When France declared war on Austria and Prussia in 1792, Britain stayed neutral at first, but in 1793, France executed Louis, and then declared war on Britain. Britain and France were longtime rivals, especially in global trading colonies. They had just fought the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. Britain feared France controlling the Low Countries like Belgium and Holland, because ports like there threatened the English Channel. Control of the colonies in the Caribbean, India, and elsewhere were also at stake. When Napoleon took power in France, he began conquering much of Europe. Britain feared a single power dominating the continent, which would threaten the balance of power that Britain relied on. Napoleon also planned to invade Britain in 1803. Even though he failed, this made Britain determined to resist him. Britain's survival depended on the Royal Navy and the overseas trade. Napoleon's continental system in 1806 tried to block British goods from Europe. Britain joined the war to break the system and keep its economy alive. But another question that rises is why didn't Britain sue for peace when they could? Britain's foreign policy for centuries was to prevent any single country from dominating Europe, whether it be Spain, France, or later Germany. Napoleon conquered Spain, Italy, Austria, and Prussia, and then threatened Russia. If he controlled the whole continent, Britain would be isolated and powerless. If Britain gave up, its economy could collapse under French restrictions. Instead, Britain used its navy to enforce its own blockade on France, starving French trade. The British elite, like kings, aristocrats, and parliament, hated Napoleon personally. They saw him as a dangerous tyrant. Propaganda painted him as a dictator who could never be trusted. Peace treaties like in Alms in 1802 quickly collapsed because neither side trusted each other. A key moment of the wars was the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where Admiral Horatio Nelson gave his life in the battle to destroy Napoleon's fleet. This secured British naval dominance for over a century. The wars were very expensive. Britain's national debt more than doubled to over £800 million. High taxes and borrowing strained ordinary people. The trade was disrupted by Napoleon's continental system, his attempt to block British goods from Europe. But Britain's Industrial Revolution gave it resilience. Factories, coal, iron, and textiles kept production growing. London overtook Amsterdam as the world's financial capital. Britain captured key colonies while France and its allies were distracted. These included Cape Town in South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Trinidad, which secured dominance in India as French influence collapsed. They also gained control of global trade routes. Heavy taxation and food shortages made it life very hard for ordinary people. Returning soldiers faced unemployment. The war period saw high foods, such as the Crown Laws of 1815, which tried to keep grain prices high for farmers but hurt the people. Protests and unrest grew, like the Peterloo Massacre in 1819. Society became more unequal, and this unrest later fueled demands for reform. The war years strengthened conservative politics. The ruling elite feared revolution like in France. The government suppressed radical groups, censored newspaper, and limited political freedoms. But after the war, pressure for reform built up, leading to the Reform Acts of 1832, expanding voting rights. The wars gave Britain a sense of national pride. Nelson and Wellington became heroes. The quote, "Rule Britannia" and naval glory became central to the British idea. The idea that Britain had saved Europe from Napoleon boosted national confidence. But this was propaganda pushed by the government to make the sacrifice seem worth it. After the war, they were getting even into more debt, and they had lost a large amount of manpower in the war. The British government took money and loans from wealthy banking families like the Rothschilds, and others lent money directly to the government. Nathan Rothschild in particular helped finance British subsidies to European allies by moving gold across Europe. Merchants and trading companies also heavily invested since victory meant protecting trade routes. This would later come back to bite them when the lenders wanted a return on investment. The pressure from protests finally forced Parliament to pass the Great Reform Act in 1832. It gave more middle-class men the right to vote. The UK passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, freeing enslaved people across most of the empire. This was a major moral and social turning point. The next foreign event that the British were involved in was the Crimean War. Britain, with France and the Ottoman Empire, fought against Russia. The cause was Russia wanted to expand into Ottoman lands, threatening the balance of power in Europe and Britain's route to India. Russia was checked, but the war showed Britain's army was outdated compared to its navy and industry. Furthermore, there were more revolutions during this time, especially in countries that still had the monarchy, or some form of it. But Britain were also affected by this. The Charleston Movement in 1838 from 1848, a mass movement of working-class people demanding democracy. The People's Charter called for universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and payments for MPs, so working men could serve. Equal-sized districts, annual parliaments, millions signed petitions, but Parliament rejected them. Though it failed immediately, many Charlists demanded that eventually adopted later in the 19th to 20th century. This was the first real mass working-class political movement in Britain, and it would not be the last. But even though Britain had some setbacks, they were still by far the strongest nation in the world. During the 18th century, Britain expanded massively overseas. They had African colonies in Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, and more. And in Asia, they controlled Malaya, Burma, and Hong Kong after the Opium Wars with China. In the Pacific, they controlled Australia, New Zealand, which was under firm British rule. By 1900s, the British Empire ruled one-fourth of the world's land and people, the largest empire in history. Britain became the workshop of the world, leading in coal, iron, textiles, and railways. The Royal Navy kept sea routes open, protecting trade from India to the Americas. London became the financial capital of the world. During this time of expansion, the phrase, "the sun never sets" on the British Empire would become prevalent. The revolution that changed the UK was the Industrial Revolution, where Britain shifted from being an agricultural society, where most people farmed, to an industrial society where people worked with machines and factories. It was powered by new technology, such as coal, iron, and steam engines. It all started with the steam engine in 1770, which powered factories, trains, and ships. Textile machinery, like the power loom, grew huge in cloth production. Iron and steel became better methods. Railways, bridges, and machines. Production moved from small shops/homes to large factories. This allowed for mass production and lowered costs and improved people's lives because they were able to buy new products for cheaper prices. More railways spread across Britain from 1820s onward, connecting cities and ports. Canals and later steamships sped up trade. Goods could now be moved more quickly across the country and the world, but living conditions in the city were often poor. There was overcrowding, pollution, and disease. A new working class emerged, with factories and miners. A new industrial middle class rose. Harsh conditions, long hours, and child labor, with dangerous machinery. Eventually, this would lead to trade unions, reforms, and better rights for the workers. The Industrial Revolution is why Britain went from a small island nation to the center of the 19th century world. In the late 19th century, you had the scramble for Africa. This is when European powers tried to carve out their own territory in Africa, and Great Britain took some important key territories. Like the Suez Canal in Egypt, and in South Africa, they went after diamonds and gold. Nigeria, Kenya, Sudan, and more. Africa provided raw materials and market, which strengthened Britain's empire and global trade. As the 19th century started to end, the world entered into the 20th century. At this turn, the British Empire was arguably at its peak. It controlled a quarter of the world, but there was another rising threat that came from Europe, and that would be the rise of the German Empire. When the German states united in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck, it created another superpower in Europe, which the British did not like, even though the British and Germans are closely related. For example, Queen Victoria was Kaiser Wilhelm II's grandmother, but they were oftentimes fighting for power. The main thing that the British feared was the Germans' naval power, which would lead to the naval arms race. The UK had long been the dominant naval power. Its empire depended on sea routes for trade and defense. The Royal Navy followed the two-power standard, meaning it had to be at least as strong as the next two largest navies combined. Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, wanted to challenge Britain's supremacy. Influenced by Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, Germany passed several of naval laws to massively expand its fleet. In 1906, Britain launched HMS Dreadnought, a revolutionary battleship. It was faster, better armed, and more powerful than any ship before. Overnight, all previous battleships became obsolete, leaving the playing field. This triggered a race. Britain and Germany both rushed to build as many dreadnoughts as possible. By 1914, Britain had 29 dreadnoughts, Germany 17. Britain still had the edge, but Germany's challenge was serious and expensive for both countries. The arms race worsened tensions between Germany and Britain. Britain felt threatened since Germany's naval power could cut off its trade and empire. It pushed Britain closer to France and Russia, helping form the Triple Entente against the Triple Alliance. While tensions all across Europe were high, the year finally came in 1914, when World War I would unfortunately begin, leading to the deaths of millions. But in the beginning, Britain didn't join the war. The trigger for Britain's declaration of war was Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium. Britain had signed the Treaty of London in 1839, promising to defend Belgium's neutrality. When Germany launched the Schlieffen Plan, invading France through Belgium, Britain issued an ultimatum. When Germany refused to withdraw, Britain declared war on August 4, 1914. Not everyone in Britain wanted to join the war. For example, there had been much propaganda against the Germans, painting them as evil, and that they would conquer the world if they didn't stop them. In the beginning, there were a lot of volunteers, but by 1960, Britain introduced forced conscription, because voluntary recruitment was no longer enough. The war dragged on for 4 years, with millions dead. After the Allies had won, they imposed an unfair treaty on the Germans, which were the Treaty of Versailles, and saw the creation of independent Poland and Czechoslovakia, with other countries as well. They knew by drawing a new maps it would cause problems for Germany, because of East Prussia being cut off from the rest of Germany. They did this intentionally to make Europe more divided, so that it could be easier to control them. Even though Great Britain had won the war, this was the beginning of the end for their empire. Their sun was beginning to set. As the 1920s began to end, something unexpected had happened. The Wall Street crash of 1929. It spread worldwide. Demand for British exports collapsed. In 1932, unemployment in Britain reached 3 million, about 20% of the workforce. The government cut spending and abandoned the gold standard in 1931, showing how weak Britain's financial system had become. Britain turned to its empire to soften the crisis. At the Ottawa Conference in 1932, Britain set up an imperial preference. It was a system where empire countries gave each other trade advantages, such as lower tariffs, favoring each other over foreign powers like the USA or Germany. This tied the empire closer economically, but also showed that Britain was relying on its empire for survival, and it gave their puppets more autonomy. Dominions such as Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand were hit hard by the collapse in the global trade. They looked to protect their own economies, and their sense of independence grew. In India, the depression worsened poverty and hunger. At the same time, Britain still demanded high taxes and kept control. This fueled the Indian nationalist movements, with Gandhi launching the Salt March in 1930, and civil disobedience campaigns. In Africa and in the Caribbean, falling prices for crops such as cotton and sugar caused hardships and protests. Many colonial workers went on strike in the 1930s. So falling back on their puppets didn't really work for the British Empire. The Depression accelerated the shift of economic power away from Britain and towards the US, which, though badly hit, recovered fast. In Germany, which rearmed under Hitler, Britain's inability to restore prosperity weakened faith in imperial leadership. By the 1930s, Britain was struggling to pay for both domestic relief and the rising need for military rearmament as war loomed. This area, the Great Depression, exposed Britain's economic fragility and made it dependent on the empire for survival, but at the same time it intensified nationalist resistance in colonies like India and caused hardship across Africa and the Caribbean. The empire looked less like a proud source of strength and more like a strained system barely holding together. The 1930s were full of nationalist unrest across the empire. For example, in India you had Gandhi, who led the civil disobedience movements. Britain had made some concessions, like the Government of India Act in 1935, but not total independence. Palestine, rising tensions between Jews and Arabs under British rule led to violence. In Africa and the Caribbean, workers, strikes, and protests spread due to Depression-era hardship. Britain leaned more heavily on its empire for resources, but struggled to contain the growing unrest. The next event that would destroy the empire would be World War II, and the reason why Britain even got involved was because of Winston Churchill. To give some context, before Winston Churchill came to office in 1940, another world war was not popular among the people of the UK, and honestly they could not afford another war with civil unrest in their colonies. Britain was still weakened by World War I and the Great Depression. Many Britons dreaded another massive war and believed the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh on Germany. Chamberlain thought if Germany's reasonable demands were met, peace in Europe could be preserved. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler several times trying to negotiate, and in September 1938 at the Munich Conference, Britain and France agreed to let Germany take the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise not to take more territory. Chamberlain returned to Britain declaring that he had, quote, peace for our time, end quote. In 1939, after Hitler invaded Poland for Danzig, the Allies declared war on Germany. And in France, where the slogan became, quote, why die for Danzig, end quote. This sentiment was spread all across France. Most people did not want this war, but their leaders and politicians did. After Poland fell, Hitler gave an offer of peace. After the Polish campaign ended, Hitler gave a speech on the Reichstag on October 6, 1939. He declared that Germany had no further territorial ambitions in Europe and invited Britain and France to negotiate peace. They declined, of course, and the war went on. But in 1940 something changed. In Britain, the leader under Chamberlain had failed after his defeat in Norway. The next question would come on who would be his successor. The obvious successor was Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, but Halifax was in the House of Lords, not the Commons, and he also leaned toward negotiating peace with Germany. The next option was Winston Churchill, who wanted the war at any cost. It didn't matter how many died, as long as the war continued. To give some background, Churchill came from a wealthy family and he grew up with privilege, but that didn't last. After joining the army in World War I, Churchill promoted the Gallipoli campaign in 1915 to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. It was a disaster with huge casualties. Churchill was forced to resign, and his career nearly collapsed. By the late 1930s, Churchill was heavily in debt. The upkeep of his country estate was enormous. He spent lavishly on staff, wine, cigars, and paintings. His income from writing wasn't always enough. He was close to having to sell his mansion just before World War II. But a group of wealthy supporters came in to save him. This was including bankers, businessmen, and political allies. They created a fund to keep him afloat. They quietly paid off much of his debt and kept his enormous estate in his hands. This wasn't public knowledge at the time, since it would have looked scandalous if the future prime minister was being bailed out by financiers. For example, one of these people that gave him money was Sir Henry Scrattosh, a South African-British banker and financier. He is perhaps the most famous of Churchill's financial supporters. In 1938, when Churchill was drowning in debt from the stock market crash and his mansion upkeep, Scrattosh paid off huge portions of his debt. He covered debts estimated at £18,000 to £20,000 in 1938 money. That equals roughly around 1.5 to 2 million pounds today. This allowed Churchill to avoid bankruptcy and keep his estate. Another one of his supporters was Bernard Bracken, a business MP and later Minister of Information, a close friend of Winston Churchill, who often helped him with financial advice and connections to wealthy backers. A U.S. financier and wealthy American investor and politician advisor, While not paying off Churchill's debt directly, Bernard supported him through friendship, hospitality, and opportunities in the U.S., which later brought Churchill income from his speeches. Without the help of these people, Churchill may have lost his estate and been politically ruined. These backers believed Britain might need his leadership against Hitler and didn't want financial troubles to silence him. Without the help of these people, Churchill would not have become the MP of Great Britain. This was just a quick overview of Churchill's past. He deserves his own video. We can only wonder what would have happened if Chamberlain stayed in power. He mostly would have made peace with Hitler after France fell, and this would have helped support the empire and make it last longer, because Hitler's real enemy was in the East for his fight against communism. But that didn't happen, and the war dragged on because of Churchill. After the Allies had won, the British Empire never returned to its old strength. Victory came with a huge cost that directly weakened the empire. The war cost Britain billions. It borrowed massively from the U.S., with the Land Lease Program, then loans in 1946. The economy was totally exhausted. Rationing continued until the early 50s. Britain had relied heavily on its colonies for troops, food, and resources. After the war, nationalist movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East were stronger than ever before. The war proved that colonies' people could fight and govern themselves. Britain was now a junior partner to America, not the world's leading power. The Cold War pushed the U.S. to pressure Britain into granting independence to colonies. The Indian independence in 1947, which was the crown jewel of the empire. When India gained independence, it split into India and Pakistan. This was the single biggest blow to Britain's imperial prestige. Later, in Palestine in 1948, Britain withdrew, unable to maintain rising violence between Jews and Arabs. Israel was declared soon after. In Africa, you had the African independence from the 1950s to the 70s. One by one, colonies in Africa won independence. In Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, and Kenya in 1963, and some other more. Britain often gave up power peacefully, but sometimes after violent struggles. The real event that showed the UK was no longer a world superpower was the Suez Crisis in 1956. After Egypt in the 1950s had a new leader under Gamal Nasser, he wanted to cut ties with Britain and France and become truly independent. He pushed the British out of the Suez Canal zone, achieved in 1956 when he nationalized the canal. Nasser tried to keep Egypt independent of both the US and the USSR. But after the US and Britain refused to fund the Aswan Dam, he turned to the Soviets for money and weapons. This made him a leader of the non-aligned movement, trying not to be trapped by either superpower. Nasser was committed to opposing the State of Israel, which he saw as a colonial project supported by the West. He fought against Israel in the Suez Crisis in 1956. Later, Britain, under Anthony Eden, France, and Israel secretly agreed to attack Egypt. Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France pretended to act as peacekeepers and bombed Egyptian forces and invaded toward the canal. Their goal was to topple Nasser and regain control of the canal. President Eisenhower was furious. For reasons, the U.S. hadn't been consulted and felt betrayed. America feared Arab nations could side with the Soviets if Britain and France looked like imperial bullies. The Cold War priority was keeping the Middle East stable and not helping old empires. Eisenhower pressured Britain and France. He threatened to sell U.S. reserves of British pounds, which would have collapsed the already weak British economy. He refused to support Britain in the United Nations. Britain, despite for U.S. financial backing, had no choice but to back down. This was total humiliation. Britain and France had to withdraw their forces in defeat. Nasser emerged as a hero in the Arab world. The world saw Britain as weak, dependent on U.S. approval. It became clear that Britain could never again act on a global power on its own. From now on, British foreign policy had to be tied closely to the United States. The crisis showed Britain couldn't maintain control over its empire anymore. Within a few years, independent movements in Africa and Asia gained speed. This was basically it. The sun finally set on the British Empire. Britain could no longer act as they wanted. They would now need the permission of the U.S. before they could act. An empire that once ruled a quarter of the world was now restricted to an island with an area of 243,000 square miles. The next problem came from overseas, which was a mass immigration into the United Kingdom. At first it was in small amounts, but as the years went on, more and more migrants came in and changed the fabric of British society. This of course caused problems, because the people coming from different countries have totally different cultures that do not clash well with British society. And with these foreigners coming in, they would concentrate in certain areas. For example, a hub would be London. And we can see as more migrants came, the crime also went up, and a lot of these foreigners who are coming to the United Kingdom don't respect the country they're coming to, and they have entitled attitudes towards the people living there. For example, these are some of the demographic profiles of offenders in London. The one, knife crimes and violence, where a young black male are disproportionately affected. In 2023, black Londoners aged 18 to 20 represented nearly half of knife offenders, despite only being 13% of the population. Black males aged 16 to 24 accounted for 47% of all knife stabbings. Other crimes such as sexual assaults included. Nearly 40% of individuals charged with sexual offenses in London were foreign nationals, while Afghans had the highest per capita rate. All of these changes didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual change in politics and optics. The government cares more about foreigners than their own people. Only time will tell how the situation in the United Kingdom will unfold, but it is clear that the people are unhappy and they want change. At this time, we can only question how the British Empire could have survived, or was its fate inevitable? It is up to you, the viewer, to decide. Thank you for watching, and let me know what you think in the comments.